And welcome everybody to this session on early years during Covid-19 and beyond. My name is Ben Cooper and I'm a researcher at the Fabian Society. Over the course of this New Year conference, around 3,200 children in England will have been born, and over 500,000 children have been born in England since restrictions began in March. Yet in the discussion around Covid and its impact, babies and our youngest are often forgotten about. But when we do hear the experiences of those 500,000 newborns, the millions of children under 5, and their parents and families, we can understand the devastating impact it has had. Many new mums being forced to give birth alone without the support of their partner, parents struggling financially, often unable to balance work and care in a way they want, families finding it far more difficult to access vital services and help during lockdown, and a rise in mental health problems, anxiety, and loneliness, both in parents and the young children themselves. This crisis has particularly hurt low-income families, young parents, families with disabled children, and those from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. Repeatedly throughout this pandemic, government incompetence and ignorance has let our young children down, risking their future. But it's important to stress that all was not well for many of our youngest citizens and their families prior to the pandemic. Poverty, health inequalities, and austerity were all reducing life chances and holding children back. There is a need for a real focus on and change in early years policy. Getting it right in those early years is so crucial for outcomes later in life. In his speech to Labour Connected last year, Keir Starmer described his vision for Britain as the best country to grow up in, but we are so far, thanks to this government over the past 10 years, from being that country. That is why the Fabian Society, along with the Centre for Social Justice, has for the last 11 months provided the Secretariat to the Cross-Party Early Years Commission. Co-chaired by Sharon Hodgson MP, who joins us today, and Edward Timpson, the Conservative MP for Eddisbury, the Early Years Commission seeks to set out an evidence-based, cross-party, long-term consensus on early years that supports child development, tackling inequality, and improving life chances. If you want to find out more about the work of the Commission, you can find the website at earlyyearscommission.org, and I'll post the link in the chat shortly. So today's discussion is a timely one, and I hope you have lots of questions for our fantastic speakers. Before I introduce our first speaker, I just want to remind you that the place to ask a question is in the Q&A section on the left-hand side of this virtual room. So our first speaker is Tulip Siddiq, the Shadow Minister for Children and Early Years and the MP for Hampstead and Kilburn. Tulip has been the Shadow Minister since January 2020 and previously held the role between 2016 and 2017. Welcome, Tulip. We're delighted to have you here, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here today. So thanks very much to the Fabian Society for inviting me, and for everyone who's in this meeting for taking time out of your sunny Sunday to listen to us. As Ben said, I'm the MP for Hampstead and Kilburn, and I'm also the Shadow Minister for Children and Early Years. If you caught me and Sharon gossiping right at the beginning, you'll also know that I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, so I'm really living and breathing the early years at the moment. The brief for the early years on the Labour front bench has been really interesting, especially because of the pandemic. All the evidence, as I'm sure a lot of you will be aware, shows that it's the first years of a child's life that makes the biggest impact on their life chances and tackling inequality, which is one of the reasons why I joined the Labour Party, and I believe a lot of my colleagues did as well. Yes, I found that it's an area of policy that's all too often overlooked. And I'll just say, thankfully, it's not being overlooked by the Fabian Society. And I want to pay tribute to them for their fantastic work in setting up the Early Years Commission, which Ben has already mentioned, and working cross-party to develop some serious policy proposals for transforming early years. And thank you, Ben. I know you're too modest to say it. But you're chairing today, and all the excellent work that you've done on this project has really been appreciated. Of course, I'm concerned about the safety of childcare workers, and I have been demanding that the evidence base behind the decision to keep early years settings open. And I've been asking constantly for the scientific reason, the scientific evidence why we've kept early years settings is open. I am grateful, as many others are, that my children will continue to receive early education throughout this lockdown because they're going to nurseries, because we all know far too many children have missed out on the essential learning and the development that goes on in nurseries and with childminders over the past year. And sadly, many of the support services that families with young children rely on have been completely inaccessible during the lockdown, whether that's children's centres being shut or providing limited service or due to pressures on local authorities. Of course, coronavirus has devastated so many families, and the hardship, disruption, and uncertainty it's caused has had a real impact on health and well-being of our youngest children. And of course, not to mention the impact on attainment gap, which early estimates suggest could widen by as much as 75% as a result of coronavirus. It's devastating. I'm sure all of you agree. And we're going to have to build back better if we want to try to readdress this. Sorry for using that dreadful phrase, but I thought it was appropriate in this context. The pandemic has also been devastating for the early years sector upon which these families rely. The providers took a huge financial hit in the first lockdown, and the low demand for childcare ever since, and particularly in this final lockdown, hopefully final lockdown, have kept their incomes very low indeed. Many are operating at a loss, and survey after survey that I look at has shown that between a quarter and a third of all nurseries, preschools, and childminders are under the imminent threat of permanent closure. This would come after 5 years where we've seen a net loss of around 14,000 childcare providers. And sadly, we know that it's providers in the most deprived areas that have been more likely to close in recent years, and they are under the greatest financial pressure right now. Covid-19 pushed a sector that already faced a £600 million funding gap to the brink of collapse. So it was chronic underfunding for years and years before the pandemic hit. And this shone a light on how badly funded the sector was, and also how the government always treated it as an afterthought, how it wasn't given the priority that it should have been. So the first thing we need to do to save the early years sector, in my opinion, which means providing targeted support to save providers and plug the huge gaps in their funding. We also, by the way, need to save what's left of the children's centres that the last Labour government's Sure Start programme set up to transform the lives of so many families. Thousands of the most disadvantaged children will miss out unless we save the services they rely upon. But what I would say is that simply saving the early years sector just isn't enough. We also need to transform them. And we need to start by treating nurseries and early years providers as a proper part of our education system, rather than an optional extra as the Conservatives have for far too long. This requires reforming pay, qualification and career opportunities for the early years force, in contrast to the present situation where, shockingly, 1 in 8 early years workers is paid under £5 an hour. And thousands of talented practitioners are leaving the sector in droves. It also means developing a sustainable funding model that doesn't punish providers for going the extra mile in providing high quality education, or punish parents financially for wanting their children to have it all. Again, compared to now, where childcare costs have risen at twice the rate of inflation since 2010. That's just a drop in the ocean of what we need to do if we want to truly transform children's life chances and root inequality out of our society. A job that must start in the early years. Keir said that making Britain the best country to grow up in is his mission, as Ben said at the beginning, and there can be no more important part of that than making sure young children can get the best possible early education and support. I've reiterated that to Keir many times, and I know he agrees with me. And I have no doubt that the next Labour government is going to transform the experience of the early years in this country for the better. And I want events like this to be the start of a big conversation on how we do that. So I'm looking forward to your questions. I'm looking forward to listening to the other experts on this panel, particularly Sharon, who's done an immense amount of work over the years on this topic. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Tulip. We really appreciate that very comprehensive look at what's happened during COVID and where we need to go and how ambitious, hopefully, that Labour will be. Our second speaker is Imran Hussain. Imran is Director of Policy and Campaign at Action for Children, after previously spending 8 years at the Child Poverty Action Group. Imran is also one of our fantastic commissioners that formed the Early Years Commission, so particularly pleased that you are here. So over to you, Imran.
Thanks, Ben. And what I thought I'd do, and also thank you, Tulip, for what you said. There's lots there that I agree with. And I think Labour's work in this area is something there's lots of overlap with what many of the sort of campaigning charities are calling for. So that's really appreciated. What I thought I'd do is just say a little bit about the importance of the early years for us as a charity, and then say a bit more about how austerity, coronavirus are affecting children in sort of two areas: children's services and in poverty. And then just to try and wrap it up if I've got time, and say a couple of other things, including hopefully a reason to be cheerful. So look, importance of early years. I think Tulip's kind of set that out. I think all of us have a good sense of it. But just to give you an idea of where I'm coming from, I work for Action for Children. We've got about 100 children's centres with lots of services around the country, other services as well for families. One of the things that we do is, we kind of when we start working with some of the children we work with, we do a baseline of where they are and the skills and deficits, and then later on we kind of update that. So just looking at the figures we've got in the last year for 0 to 2s in children's centres, I can see that our intervention children's centres, there was a 72% increase in children where the dimension of warm, supportive relationship with parent and carer. So our services helped improve that. Our service helped improve developmental milestones in 72% of cases as well. And in 71% of cases, parents and carers have improved their mental well-being. So these services are really important, and we say that because the academic evidence says that, but also from our own services, that's the sort of day in day out reality that we see. So that's the first thing, and then just moving on to kind of practical families. It's almost like this generation of children. I mean, this generation of children, if you think about it, are living in or will be living in the shadow of austerity, of Brexit, and coronavirus. So I'm going to coin that the ABC generation. So that's they've grown up in that, and that's if we don't sort things out properly for these children, that those will hang over like a cloud over their life chances. So starting off around children's services. So children's services basically have funded by local authorities. As you all know, local authorities have been absolutely clobbered when it comes to their funding. And we've, reports that we've done with other children's charities has found that central government funding for children's services fell by about a quarter over the decade. Now, local authorities have done their best to shield children from that cut. And so local government spending on children's services has fallen by 6%, right? So funding has gone down by 23%, spending has gone down by 6%. And the reason why, and local authorities are kind of shielding because they've been using up the reserves, right? That's not sustainable. So, and one consequence of all of this pressure on local authorities is that they're going to prioritise their statutory responsibilities. And so when children are in crisis and they're in risk of harm, those services are being prioritised. What's not being prioritised are the early years, early help services that kind of reduce demand in the long term, right? So like youth services, like children's centres. So children's centres, the funding for those are being cut by over 60%. Southern Trust have estimated over 1,000 have closed. So what, it's a bit like you wouldn't have an NHS that's comprised solely of A&E units. Like, no primary care, no public health. You think, that we'd see that as dangerous and irresponsible. But the way things are going with children's services is that we're going to have children's services where the funding is largely on the blue light service of putting children in care or helping children at the edge of care, not down the line. So that's a real worry that we've got. And so our analysis found that in 2010, the proportion of children's services money that was spent on late intervention was 58%. Now it's 78%. So you can see how it's all swinging. So we need more money to kind of fix that. So of course, local authorities need the funding to deal with children in care, but we've also got to reduce demand for that through the other services, like early help services. On poverty, again, like I think people here will have a good sense of what's happening, but Labour in government prioritised child poverty. On the measure, over 1 million children were taken out of poverty. Huge progress. Not as much as we would have wanted, but huge progress nonetheless. Since then, obviously, progress has gone into reverse, and now we've got the pandemic. We had to set up, Action for Children. We're not a poverty charity in a way. We work for disadvantaged children. We've got a whole range of services. But before the pandemic, our services staff, our frontline staff, wanted us to prioritise child poverty more because of what they were seeing. And then with the pandemic, we had to set up an emergency fund, giving out grants to families. And that, yes, huge chunks of that was going on food, but also about almost a third was going on learning resources. So there, I would say that, yes, it's a no-brainer that the £20 uplift in universal credit should be taken away. But I also think long-term, we've got to address inadequacy in the benefit system. And that might be, for example, try and take some of the politics out of it by having an independent body making recommendations for minimum increases in benefit levels. We need something to kind of address the long-term inadequacy problem. So I've talked about children's services. I've talked about child poverty. Overall, all this stuff says that, with the pandemic, the government has rightly focused on saving lives. It's rightly focused on livelihoods. But children's life chances haven't been a priority. And, you can see with the way the government's reacting to Rashford, if pushed and there's enough political pressure on any particular day, there might be a shift forward, but no real long-term effort. And just before I wind up, the kind of two things I want to say. One is a lack. It's not a good sign. There's a lack of accountability in this area. So government scrap child poverty targets. Prime Minister denies what's happening on child poverty and gets told off by the stats authorities. Same on early years. There's no outcomes framework. There's lack of clarity about what is it we're trying to achieve. Now, the reason, a reason to be optimistic is the Royal Foundation, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge's foundation. I think they had a big report out end of last year talking about the need for society to understand the importance of the early years and to support parents. So they'll be doing more work around this. And I think there's an opportunity there to kind of change the national conversation about the early years. Thank you.
Thank you, Iman. That was really good, particularly on local government and the challenges they're facing. Before I bring Gary in, I'd just like to remind everybody, if you want to ask a question to our fantastic panelists, you've been here for 2 days now. I don't really need to direct you where you can ask questions, but it is on the left-hand side with the little question mark button. So please do ask some questions. So our third speaker is Councillor Gary Bridges. Gary is a Manchester City Councillor for Old Moat and is Executive Member for Children and Schools. We're delighted to have you here, Gary, to provide an all-important local government perspective. So over to you, Gary.
Thanks, Ben, and thank you for having this session, inviting me. As Tulip said at the start, I think it really gets to the heart of what we are about as a party, giving children the best chance in life, and all too often it is neglected as a topic. I think the COVID pandemic itself, it's become a bit of a cliche, really, that it's exposed things that we already knew about society, but laid them out pretty starkly. So it has shown just how rife inequality is in our society. In Manchester, we have about half of our children that grow up in poverty, and those children and their families' experience of lockdown will be much, much worse than their peers, and it will have an impact all throughout their life in a way that it won't for some of their peers who can bounce back or catch up much more quickly with the resources they've got at their disposal. But it's also, the sector has certainly felt that it's also shown, what the thing that Tulip said at the start is that often they are seen as an afterthought. And all throughout this crisis, we have seen guidance that is focused around statutory school age children. And then they just sort of say, and the early years. And they don't recognise the fact that that covers a very wide range of early years settings through private daycare providers, nursery classes within a school setting, nursery schools, and they all have very different arrangements, but they're all too often brushed under kind of the same guidance. At the moment, the sector is facing a really acute short-term problem because they're currently told that they must stay open, but they're also, families are choosing to follow government advice and guidance and stay at home and not send the children in sometimes. But they have been warned that they will only be funded on census data currently, whereas previously they were able to honour all of the funding for people that are on their rolls. So yet again, we're seeing COVID guidance that puts early years settings at a really crucial kind of crisis moment, and that's because they are very often an afterthought. I think some of the things that we know as we come out of the COVID situation will be problems that existed already. So we've already spoken about poverty, but it really has become a sort of phenomenal problem. All of our children's centres and all of our children and family services tell us that all they are now is inundated with requests for food and food help, and that is taking up all of their time, and that's absolutely not a sustainable way to run children's services. So Imran's point is we need to make sure that the benefit system actually supports families to feed their children, and that should be a basic precondition for any sort of decent society, really. One of the other things that we need to look at is the funding model for early years. There's been some good changes about universal entitlement to childcare, but unfortunately, what that has meant in practice is that many daycare providers then are getting paid much less than they used to, because the base rate that government funds them at may well be lower than some parents used to pay. And if they are funded for a certain amount of hours, parents may choose to then make up that extra time by taking time off, having 1 day's cover with a grandparent, etc. So what it means is that, plus the combination of the increases in national minimum wage and all of those other things, which are good in themselves, have translated to a sector which is really hit on its budget, and they are operating at the slightest margins constantly. So if there's any crisis like this one, it means they very, very quickly go under. So what we've tried to do in this country over the last sort of 10 years, really, under Conservative and the coalition, is try to provide that early years education offer on the cheap. So we are increasing entitlement and increasing kind of the wages and those things, but we're not increasing the rate of pay at a rate that makes that sustainable for our settings. So we urgently need to address that. And then, as Imran said about council budgets, obviously I'm directly responsible for the children's services budget in Manchester. So to say we've been clobbered is really an understatement. And yet again, this year in Manchester, we are having to make £50 million worth of cuts to our budget. We've done as much, we've cut every year for the last 10, 11. So there's not many places you can go. And most of our spending is children and adult services now. And so the point that Imran was making about about targeted and early intervention versus your higher level statutory services. In Manchester, we have protected our early help services, but they don't deliver what I think we would consider as early help. They are, very high level interventions with families with quite profound and complex problems, and particularly for the early years. Even our universal offer, so your health visitors and your early years settings, what we are actually asking them to do is look out for families with additional needs. So even within the universal offer, there is a sort of embedding now of a targeted offer. So what that means in practice is when people have resources are scarce, you're in danger of pitting universal against targeted and specialist support, whereas actually for a proper early years service, any of those additional needs need to be built on a really solid foundation of a universal offer, and then that is funded fully and properly. I think that's one thing that we really do need to make clear as a party. That, obviously Keir said that we want to be considered the party of the family, and I think that's great. I think having a commitment to that universal early years offer, which I think the public support and welcome, would be a good way to start that. A couple of people had mentioned about the issue of workforce as well, and that is a massive problem. So in Manchester, we've had a massively rising school age population, and so all of our services are under a lot of pressure, particularly our health visitors, who've not obviously increased at the same rate, but we can't recruit them. There aren't enough health visitors out there because there's been no plan, just as there haven't been in the NHS, for providing that workforce of the future. And I think there's a real opportunity here. So whenever I go and see our children's centres and our daycare settings, what I'm struck by is who actually works there. Quite often they are mums, and they are mums who come from perhaps less advantaged backgrounds, very diverse backgrounds as well in terms of ethnic mix and background and heritage. And they have usually engaged with those services as a mum who were, and found them really valuable, started to volunteer, then become a paid employee, and then started training up to be practitioners themselves. And I think that actually, as well as being a challenge, our early years settings and our early years services have such a reach into communities in our country that a lot of other places don't. And it actually has a real potential if we see that as something to be invested in. So I think we need to build a workforce kind of the future. That whenever people talk about workforce of the future, they often think about technology and green and all of those kind of things, and they're all great. But for some people, it's actually this setting, this sector, that can actually deliver massive improvements both to the children but also the people working in it. And I think as a party, we should be really committed to that. And then I think lastly, one of the things is about the integration of early years services with the sort of social welfare system more generally. Because what we know is, and increasingly we're talking about, is children aren't in isolation, children are in families, and if children need support, then probably their parents need support or their grandparents, and building a picture of what that whole family means. So obviously whole family thinking is very key to sort of early help and troubled families and all of that kind of thing. But it's no good if working in that model then means you run up against deficiencies in adult support. So if you've identified that family has problems because a parent has a substance problem or mental health problem of their own, or they're in poverty themselves, you actually need to fund the adult social world better so that there is actually an answer to some of those things. I don't think you can kind of address one without the other. So I think we need to make those connections really clear.
Thank you, Gary, and for that comprehensive perspective. And I should just, on the workforce of the future, I should give a shout out to the other Fabian Society Commission on Work and Technology, which is currently holding an event related to their report launch, which had and touched on this, relating to how childcare and other care work can be the profession of the future, because it's far more difficult to automate care work compared to other jobs. But we're talking about the Early Years Commission for this event. So our fourth speaker is Sharon Hudson. As I mentioned earlier, Sharon is one of our co-chairs of the Early Years Commission, as well as being the Shadow Minister for Veterans since April 2020 and the MP for Washington and Sunderland West. Previously, Sharon served on the front bench as Shadow Minister for Public Health, and before that as Shadow Minister for Children and Families. So over to you, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you to you and the Fabian Society for all of the work that you're doing, prioritising the early years, not just with the Commission, but with sessions such as this today, and what you have done in the years gone by as well. I know you've devoted a huge amount of your time to this, so I thank you. It really is a pleasure to be here today on this panel speaking with you all, and I echo and agree with all of our speakers so far, which will not surprise you. It's really great also to see that the Fabian Society have managed to continue to hold their annual conference even in this third lockdown. And obviously I wish we could all be together face to face, and I hope that we'll be able to do so very soon. But at least we haven't all had to travel far in this awful weather to see one another. As you've heard, I'm the Labour Member of Parliament for Washington and Sunderland West, and that's been for over 15 years now, elected in 2005. And I currently sit on the front bench as the Shadow Minister for Veterans. But you might have been going to ask, well, why am I here talking about the early years? But as Ben has said, I was Shadow Children and Families Minister for 5 years, 2010 to 15, then Shadow Public Health for 5 years. More recently, with Edward Timpson, we've been chairing the Fabian's Early Years Commission, and I used to shadow Ed, and we also currently sit together on the cross-party Early Years Advisory Review, which is a government review led by Andrea Leadsom. So it seems the double act that is Ed Timpson and I seems to be in much demand at the moment. Now, I know you're all aware and have heard eloquently from our guest speakers before me, but let me reiterate just how crucial the early years are to a child's development and why this issue should be a top priority for any government, not just a Labour government. Each year, 185,000 children will start school unprepared to learn, and children eligible for free school meals are 1.5 times more likely to be behind their peers in early learning and development. The first 1,001 critical days, as we call them, matter more to a child's development than any other single period in their life. And adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, as we call them, affect us as adults more than any other factor in our life to that point. 1 in 8 people have 4 or more ACEs, and people with 4 or more ACEs are twice as likely to develop addictions and therefore liver disease. And another one is they are 4.5 times as likely to develop depression when compared to those with no ACEs or fewer ACEs. So, it really is important that children have the best, start in life, and that we prevent those ACEs before they occur, especially during the first 1,001 critical days. So this includes investing in early years measures that will make parents aware of the impact of ACEs, provide support to help them overcome potential risk factors early on, and install programs that help young children's brains develop healthily. However, chronic underfunding by this government has let young children and families down, with many not able to access the support that they really do need. Parents are not adequately supported either financially or by the services to spend time with their children in the earliest years. And a lot of this we've been looking at on the Fabian Commission, and we'll be coming forward with recommendations soon on all of this. The key people in helping to prevent ACEs, therefore, are the early years workforce, who I would like to pay tribute to today for they work hard to help our young children on their journey at the very start of their lives. And this work is so important. So I therefore believe they should be trained well, but also paid well for this work. However, there is room for structural improvement in the early years environment that Britain offers. And currently there is a lack of joined up support for parents. Many parents find it difficult to access services without going through lots of tricky hoops and processes. Early years services have a tendency to work independently of one another. And tired parents, holding their crying baby at 3 a.m. We've all been there, Tulip more recently than I. They do not always have the energy at the next day to proactively look for the help that they may need. Indeed, maternity services, health visitors, social care, maternal mental health services, and children's centres or family hubs, whatever we end up calling them, I'm not going to get hung up on their name, should all work closely together to share data, ensuring those who need additional support receive appropriate, timely, and culturally sensitive assistance. Coronavirus has made this problem much worse. Parents are told to stay home under national restrictions, and having a newborn baby can be a really isolating time anyway. And I've heard, I'm sure you have, some heartbreaking stories of women giving birth alone, going for scans alone, spending huge amounts of time alone with their baby. Now, these babies and toddlers, coming up now, may not have even socialized with other children yet. And, these restrictions also make it much worse and harder for parents to reach out for help. especially when grandparents may have went many months without meeting their new grandchild. Some may have never yet held their new grandchildren yet. So the mental health of parents has come to the fore, and as we understand the impacts of the coronavirus measures. And an idea which has been floated is that each family could have simple access to virtual support via the internet, which would open up more access to support. But obviously, we're all aware of the issues around access to the internet and the digital divide. And, COVID has exposed that divide to us all as children struggle to access learning from home. But as much as coronavirus has made the need for change immediate, we need to look past the pandemic. The children in their early years now will, I hope, grow into a world not dominated by coronavirus. Given the government's failures, we can't be sure of that. And maybe Chris Whitty will be saying, next slide, please, well into 2040. But as I say, I hope not. I want to make our agenda that we're discussing today the agenda of parents, educators and legislators across the UK as we look to remodel the UK after the pandemic. As you've heard from Tulip and Kia many times, Labour aim to make this country the best country to grow up in and the best country to grow old in. And so a new early years programme is the perfect foundation to build upon. So thank you again for having me to speak to you today, and I'm looking forward to the questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you. Since this might be the only time I can do it publicly, thank you for all the work you've done as a co-chair of the Early Years Commission. It's been a really fantastic experience over the past 11 months. It's hard to believe it has been 11 months. It's gone so quickly, the work that we've done. I know, Tulip, that you have to dash, but can I ask on kind of my own behalf, one quick question. It relates to what Sharon said around shift to digital services. Is there anything that you think that we can take out of this shift to digital in the early years, or should we seek as far as possible to go back to doing things in person?
And Ben, I will answer that, but I actually looked at the questions in the chat and I've written some notes. Do you want me to go through them or not? You sure?
If you can do them in one big comprehensive answer.
Is that okay? Because I feel bad not answering the question. So let me answer some of them and then I'll head off after that. So in answer to your question, Ben, the first thing I'd say is, of course, we want face-to-face interaction. I mean, it's a huge part of staying in touch. When Sharon was going through what happens to new mothers after you've had a child, I keep remembering my own experience and how lucky I was that I didn't have a child during the coronavirus, but I just escaped it, actually. I only had a child a year before. So I would have been very isolated if I didn't have that network of mothers and people to reach out to in the community. So I would like to do things face to face, but Ben, I have to add that we've got to be careful for now. I mean, we really sympathize with everyone who's in that situation, but we're in a situation now where unless we stay home and get the rate of infection down, we might be in this situation for a very long time. It's as a country, personally, I think the government should have stayed in the first lockdown a bit longer and not promised lots of people loosening the restrictions over Christmas and getting people's hopes up. And I know they pulled back on some of the countries. But for me, I think at this point, if we can get the infection rate down, go back to normal, that's all I want. So as much as I feel that interaction is important at the moment, I do think, there are some exceptions. For example, letting your spouse in when you're having a baby, I think that's one of the things we should really allow. I just don't know how I would have coped having two children without my husband there. So things like that, I think we need to look at. But overall, for me at the moment, the priority is getting the rate of infection down. In terms of the questions, I'm just going to quickly go through this. The question on census, you're absolutely right. I've written notes here, so I'm just looking at them, that the government must U-turn on this year's spring funding changes. And it beggars belief, really, that they're pressing ahead with the census as a means of determining funding at this time. I just don't know why they're doing it. And as you say, many nurseries and other providers will face closure as a result. However, the latest guidance, which I just looked at, it's not all that clear, but it does look like the government is now going to fund providers for children who would be expected to attend this term, but they're not attending for reasons due to coronavirus, like their parents are worried about the infection, or the setting is temporarily closed due to an outbreak. That's the latest guidance. So as long as the provider is making that place available for that child, it looks like the funding situation slightly changed. And that's slightly better than the position we were in before. But obviously, I'm very aware that with far fewer children expected to attend this term, the funding changes will still be devastating. There will still be closures, and we will be campaigning on that. On children's play, I would say, given some of the questionable changes this government's made to early years foundation stage, I think we need to take another look at this when we're in government, and the emphasis we place on play is obviously crucial to child's early development. Sharon touched on this, and I've certainly seen it, not just with my own children, but I've seen it in every report that I've ever read. And I know how lucky we are in this country to have the ability to play, and I think it should be prioritized. In terms of inequalities in the education system, and Ben, apologies for just going through this, I do really want to address all of it, is that I think the truth is that we need to transform the way we think about the education element of what early years providers do. I think it's attitudinal as much as anything else, and not just focusing on childcare, because of course that's important for working families, but high quality early education is the key to what we can do to tackle inequalities at the root of society. I sincerely believe that, and I think that will narrow the attainment gap even before children reach school, and that's something we need to invest in and that we need to promote the importance of. And I feel like until we address that, we're not going to root out inequality in society. And finally, just to say on workforce recruitment and retention, I could go on about this for hours, but the first thing we need to do, I feel, is attract more people from different backgrounds to the early years sector. We need to pay them better. And that's my number one thing. Unless we pay them better, we're never going to improve the workforce, never going to attract people from different backgrounds. And we need to fund the sector better. That's the thing I've been calling on the government. As soon as I stand up in the chamber, they know what I'm going to say. I'm going to say fund the sector better. Don't treat it as an afterthought. We need to put in structures that make people see the sector as a place that they can work in, they can progress, they can have a proper career. And we need to look at national pay scales and how we revamp the qualifications and the apprenticeships work in the sector. All in all, we need to take the sector seriously, and I don't feel the government does that. Sorry, that's very doom and gloom, but I think it's the reality of the sector.
Thank you, Tulip, and have a wonderful party, Zoom party, with your boys. We really appreciate you giving time up on this important day to speak to Fabian members, and I'm sure that the next panel, hopefully we can do it in person or some sort of hybrid. So thank you again.
Thank you.
We'll focus on that specific question around attracting and retaining early years workers. I suppose, Gary, is there anything that local government can do or is doing to try and increase retention, increase qualifications, increase the pipeline?
Yeah, I mean, there are areas we can and areas that we kind of do, and we're also, like, in places like Manchester, for example, are looking at how we can do that on a Greater Manchester level with devolution. And I know, Andy Burnham has put a lot of his own kind of energy into looking at some of these things. We've had quite a lot of GM conferences and looked at things like workforce. The workforce is obviously a very broad workforce. So when we talk about an early years workforce, we mean quite a whole range of things. So as I said before, when I go and see our children's centres, for example, on the ground, they've got a fantastic record of working with parents and getting them into the sector. But what you do find is the challenges of, if you want to then progress and do learning alongside working and looking after your own children, that's really hard. So there actually needs to be some resources behind that, through things like bursaries, to actually allow people to kind of develop. So they might find that we've done quite a good job getting them into entry-level positions in a sector, but actually if they've got aspirations to kind of learn and go on, then it does need some money behind that. And that's similar to other more specialist kind of roles as well. So obviously, as I said about health visitors, we do need a proper development pipeline for health visitors, and that will need to come with bursary support and that kind of thing as well. But then, speech and language interventions and parenting courses and things, they all have kind of a specialism. And I think what they need is a proper plan about how you can actually get people to be able to support themselves while getting those advanced skills. And that's kind of similar in other sectors, but we just don't do that at all now as a country. We just kind of let people, if they can get on off their own kind of resources, fine, but otherwise there's no real sort of planning to help with that, even though early years, similar to NHS, it is a national priority and it's a social good as well as for the person themselves. So we do need to be putting more time and investment into it.
Great. Imran, I suppose local government and national government, what can we do on retention and recruitment?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound boring, but I think money still, is the funding is still a key issue here. So earlier last year in 2020, there was a publication of the I always struggle to say this, but it's the triennial serious case reviews. So whenever a child is harmed, seriously harmed or dies, there's a serious case review done. And so the triennial one is a review of 3 years worth of those. And I'll put it into the box earlier, in the box side in a minute. But the last ones talked about, it had examples of how workload and budgetary pressures were threatening professional practice, and through that, and I'll quote, imperil children's safety and welfare. So all these things, if we want to do right by children, retain staff, then we've got to tackle things like caseloads and those kind of pressures. So I would say a lot of it just does go back to funding. I mean, on Friday, the government launched its review into the care system for children. And I think the encouraging thing about that is that the independent reviewer, who was founded the Teach, I forget its name now, but the social care equivalent of Teach First, he basically was saying that, look, that yes, they won't take a narrow approach. They won't just look at who's children in care right now and what we can do for them, but also thinking about the whole ecosystem and making sure that, I think he was making the point there that there would be some kind of discussion around, the pressures that are leading children to go into the system. So for us, we see there's a revolving door at the start of the system for the reasons I outlined earlier. There are kids who could get help, but we're not helping because of cuts. And there's a revolving door at the end of the system, because when children leave care, for example, one of the main routes out is like family reunion. They go back to their family, but that often breaks down. So what can we do to kind of strengthen that? So a lot of this is just making, at the moment the system's under too much stress.
Great. Sharon, on anything to add on recruitment and retention of childcare workers?
Totally agree with what Imran and others have said. Tulip said, whenever we get the chance, we go on about how the workforce should be paid better and trained better. Took down that Tulip said that 1 in 8 early years workforce are paid under £5 an hour. I mean, that'll obviously be because of their age, because they're young, or they're apprentices. I mean, under £5 an hour in this day and age, I mean, how can anyone make that work? And how can we even hope to have, the workforce that our children need and deserve? They're going to feel so undervalued and underappreciated. And, with the best will in the world, you can't help resent the job you do under those circumstances. So it's just, we don't want anyone going to work resenting their job in any way. We want them to be, as happy as they can be in order to, support our children. So they need to be well trained and well rewarded for that sort of really good and important job that they do. So it all comes down to funding, doesn't it? I mean, we keep getting told by this Tory government it isn't about money, but it really, really is.
Absolutely. And Sharon, what about Robin Sutcliffe's question on the importance of child play?
Yeah, absolutely. Tulip touched on this a bit, but when I was Shadow Children and Families in 2010 to 2015, it was a major issue because there had been Play England or whatever it was called, play was so important that we even had sort of a body, a quango, if you like, that supported play, and we had there was an actual dedicated budget for play, and lots of our areas all had sort of outdoor play, playgrounds built. What are they called, the ones with the zip lines and the big wheels, not just sort of your little play park, but really serious, what you would have to play, and they were free of charge. And I remember in the early days of the coalition government, Michael Gove, Battersea, the big beautiful play area, outdoor play area in Battersea became, remember Imran shaking, nodding his head, that was like one of the first battles we had on this, and they were going to introduce charges, and we had a big fight, and then they didn't introduce charge, but eventually I think it closed, or they did introduce charges. Anyway, we lost the battle. We had a short reprieve, but ultimately lost the overall battle. Play is just so important. It shouldn't just be left up to it should be a government agenda. It really does matter. It shouldn't just be left up to the private sector and those who therefore can afford to pay to take their children to great play environments. So yeah, I think when we get back into government, we've got to reinstitute sort of funding for play, and also a body that is responsible for play in turn.
Thank you, Sharon. Imran?
Yeah, I think we'll be hearing more about play in the sense of very young children next year, with all the kind of, if there's going to be an attempt to kind of a campaign to kind of inform the public a bit more about the value of the early years and the support we give to parents. And we know from the evidence that poorer kids have fewer opportunities for play, whether that's down to my son plays for a football team. There's a subscription to that, like those kind of things just put kids off playing. And then of course, if you may have less access to to play areas if you're in a low-income family, and that's why accident rates for kids from on low incomes are higher, because there's less space for them to play in safe areas. So really important. And obviously, I think as Shan was alluding to, it should tie in with the health agenda and obesity and those kind of discussions.
Okay, man. Gary?
Yeah, I think it might be the time for play, to be honest, because I think if anything's going to show the value of play, it's been its absence this year. So I know lots of people with children and things, and they say, well, my child just hasn't shared a toy for a year or communicated with another child about a shared kind of activity for a year. And I think sometimes play can be taken for granted, and people just think kids are just mucking around having fun, but actually they're not. They're building skills that are kind of crucial to their later development. I think having that stripped away for what could potentially be 18 months will kind of show people the value of it. And I think it's another reason why we need to make sure that the sector is kind of supported. So in Manchester, we've got nursery schools, and not only do they do stuff obviously for the kids that kind of attend those, but they also do kind of sector-led peer-to-peer training and sort of lead a lot of workforce development for us. And they are very passionate about the role of play and about its sort of the local champions really for play. So I think that's another aspect which, if we're thinking about workforce in future, we shouldn't just be thinking kind of big government kind of state-led stuff. We should be thinking actually what are practitioners doing and what can we kind of help them to do better kind of and lead each other.
Fantastic. We've got a question from Catherine, who's from Wales. Obviously this is a conversation that's about England, because early education is a devolved matter, and it's about so Welsh Labour has a childcare offer for all parents of 3 to 4 year olds. In England, there is an incredibly complex picture, but the sort of free entitlement depends on whether or not you're working, the amount of hours that you work. So I suppose firstly, should we be extending entitlements to parents who are perhaps not in work? Is there another metric by which we should judge entitlements? And I suppose there's a broader question in this, which I know, Sharon, we're trying to answer the commission, sort of the balance. Do we get what's currently now right, or do we try and extend the entitlement that we've currently got? I suppose, should we go to Imran first and then you, Sharon, and then to Gary? Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Imran?
Sorry?
Did that make sense to the question?
I think so. I mean, let's see if I make sense. But yeah, I think there's definitely an issue that the government sees childcare really as like, where can parents warehouse children so they can go to work, and that's a really limited approach. All the evidence around which kind of justifies we doing a sort of early childhood education and childcare is about high quality provision. So yeah, we need to get the quality right, as well as the affordability and the availability, and we it's not there. So I think, and that's I think Lucy Power's done work also, which shows that a lot of the money that's going on childcare just is being spent on is being claimed by pretty well off parents. So there's definitely an issue there, a big sort of structural issue in terms of what's happening now, which should be better.
Sharon?
Yes, this is the $64 million question, isn't it? What is the purpose of childcare? Is it child development, early education, or is it childcare to enable parents to work? And obviously both are equally important. But the question is therefore, which part of that should the state support and pay for? Should it be in order for parents to go out to work, or should it be for the child development aspect? And I think, when we look to how other countries do it, and we always talk about Scandinavia, they do seem to get a lot more bang for their buck. And I know IPPR Fabians, this commission, previous commissions have looked at the childcare economy. And when I was children's minister, I would always talk about the leaky buckets, that there's somewhere in our system, money just we don't seem to get the value for that money that other countries do. And I know we can't just scrap it all and start again, but I definitely think we need to be, looking at this childcare economy and getting more for it. Parents in this country pay some of the most expensive childcare out of a lot of the comparable countries, and yet we don't, they maybe don't go as many hours as they might get in other countries, and yet our childcare workforce are paid, a paltry amount of money and for all the excellent work that they do. So something just isn't right with our system. But yeah, I think, there needs to be a bit of both. We need to, have a childcare offer that helps parents work, but also it's got to be good quality and it's got to be there for the children who need it, even if their parents aren't working.
Right. Thank you, Sharon. Gary?
Yeah, I think obviously there is that tension, isn't there, about what it's for. I think personally we are at a critical point where if you add up the social goals for wanting to provide to enough children that kind of might miss out on natural advantages and a universal offer, plus the increasing expectation that we want to provide a universal offer to working families, that there is a strong argument to extend the universal offer for all age groups across and all kind of family circumstances. What I think, though, we then also need to do, and it's touched on earlier, is make sure that our relationship with the sector is one that recognises that. So it's in the past we might have seen early years settings in particular as primarily a business, renting a space, delivering a service to a family, and that's kind of the relationship we had with them. I know it's raised some difficult things for me in Manchester, for example. We had a lot of our settings on, fairly commercial rent bases. When you add the fact they're paying commercial rent, they're paying business rates, but actually they're paid by the state in terms of grant funding at a very slim margin for them. So if we're increasingly going to pay them through the state, we need to look at that relationship and make sure that it's one that's sustainable and works for them. It's not just a business relationship. And I think as part of that, we need to integrate them into the wider sort of welfare state really a lot better. I know when I go and see nurseries, they do loads. They do early help assessments for us. You know, they know all about their families, but they feel that schools, other places may not listen to their expertise in quite the way they listen to other professionals. So I think, yeah, we should extend the universal entitlement, but as alongside that, recognise what that means for that relationship.
Thank you, Gary. And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. I have many more questions, but unfortunately time has passed. So thank you, Sharon, thank you, Imran, thank you, Gary, and of course thank you, Tulip, for making time today. The next, I should actually say, the Early Years Commission is coming to its final stages, so keep an eye out for that. And in terms of the conference today, we are back at, I believe, 2 with some more panel discussions, but in the meantime, thank you for watching, and thank you for attending. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ben.